Okay. Good evening, everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome Alison MacLeod on my far right and Susie Riddle and the spirit of Katherine Mansfield to Small Wonder. We particularly wanted to honour Katherine Mansfield on the 125th anniversary of her birth, both because she's an exemplary writer of short stories and also because she was one of the few contemporary authors whom Virginia Woolf respected and admired. Alison MacLeod was raised in Canada and is currently Professor of Contemporary Fiction at the University of Chichester. She's also a novelist and short story writer. Her most recent novel, her current novel, Unexploded, was longlisted for this year's Man Booker Prize. It's set in Brighton during World War II, and Virginia Woolf makes a cameo appearance, although her influence on the principal character and on the writing is far from fleeting. Susie Riddle has actually come to our rescue this evening because we had one or two other actresses who were dragged off the stage before they had the opportunity to make an appearance because other commitments then clashed. So we're particularly appreciative that Susie has joined us very much at the last moment. Susie has worked in theatre, TV and radio, where her many credits include 1984, which has just been awarded the prestigious Prix Italia, which I gather is one of the most, if not the most important awards for radio, Frankenstein and Ulysses, and recently she read Deep Sea and Foreign Going on Book of the Week. She's also the voice of Tracy Horrobin in The Archers. So none of you have listened to Ulysses, but you all... A little bit of culture goes a long way. And she runs her own theatre company. So this evening we'll start with the voice of Katherine Mansfield. Susie is going to read one of a quintessential Katherine Mansfield story, Garden Party. It's slightly abridged. It was abridged by Richard Hamilton, and we're very grateful to him. And it's been produced by Di Spears of BBC Radio 4. So I'm going to hand over to Susie, who will read Garden Party by Katherine Mansfield, and then Alison MacLeod will tell us a lot more about Katherine Mansfield. So Susie and Alison.
The Garden Party. And after all, the weather was ideal. They could not have had a more perfect day for a garden party if they had ordered it. Windless, warm, the sky without a cloud. Only the blue was veiled with a haze of light gold, as it is sometimes in early summer. The gardener had been up since dawn mowing the lawns, and as for the roses, hundreds, yes, literally hundreds, had come out in a single night. The green bushes bowed down as though they had been visited by archangels. Breakfast was not yet over before the men came to put up the marquee. "Where do you want the marquee put, Mother?" "My dear child, it's no use asking me. I'm determined to leave everything to you children this year. Forget I am your mother. Treat me as an honoured guest." But Meg could not possibly go and supervise the men. She had washed her hair before breakfast, and she sat drinking her coffee in a green turban, with a dark, wet curl stamped on each cheek. Josie, the butterfly, always came down in a silk petticoat and a kimono jacket. "You'll have to go, Laura. You're the artistic one." Away Laura flew, still holding her piece of bread and butter. It's so delicious to have an excuse for eating out of doors, and besides, she loved having to arrange things. She always felt she could do it so much better than anybody else. 4 men in their shirt sleeves stood grouped together on the garden path. They carried staves covered with rolls of canvas, and they had big tool bags slung on their backs. They looked impressive. Laura wished now that she was not holding that piece of bread and butter, but there was nowhere to put it, and she couldn't possibly throw it away. She blushed and tried to look severe and even a little bit short-sighted as she came up to them. "Good morning," she said, copying her mother's voice. But that sounded so fearfully affected that she was ashamed and stammered like a little girl. "Oh, have you come? Is it about the Marquis?" "That's right, miss," said the tallest of the men, a lanky, freckled fellow, and he shifted his tool bag, knocked back his straw hat, and smiled down at her. "That's about it." His smile was so easy, so friendly, that Laura recovered. What nice eyes he had, small but such a dark blue. And now she looked at the others. They were smiling too. "Cheer up, we won't bite," their smile seemed to say. How very nice workmen were. And what a beautiful morning. She mustn't mention the morning. She must be businesslike. The Marquis. "Well, what about the lily lawn? Would that do?" And she pointed to the lily lawn with the hand that didn't hold the bread and butter. The tall fellow frowned. "I don't fancy it," said he. "You want to put it somewhere where it'll give you a bang slap in the eye, if you follow me." Laura's upbringing made her wonder for a moment whether it was quite respectful of a workman to talk to her of bangs slap in the eye, but she did quite follow him. "A corner of the tennis court, but the band's going to be in one corner." "Going to have a band, are you?" said another of the workmen. "Look here, miss, that's the place, against those trees. That'll do fine." Against the karakis. Then the karaki trees would be hidden. And they were so lovely, with their broad, gleaming leaves and their clusters of yellow fruit. They were like trees you imagined growing on a desert island, proud, solitary, lifting their leaves and fruits to the sun in a kind of silent splendor. Must they be hidden by a marquee? They must. Already the men had shouldered their staves and were making for the place. Only the tall fellow was left. He bent down, pinched a sprig of lavender, put his thumb and forefinger to his nose and snuffed up the smell. When Laura saw that gesture, she forgot all about the karakis in her wonder at him caring for things like that. How many men that she knew would have done such a thing? Oh, how extraordinarily nice workmen were, she thought. Why couldn't she have workmen for her friends, rather than the silly boys she danced with and who came to Sunday night supper? She would get on much better with men like these. It's all the fault, she decided, of these absurd class distinctions. Well, for her part, she didn't feel them. Not a bit. Not an atom. And now there came the chock-chock of wooden hammers. Someone whistled. Someone sang out, "Are you all right there, matey?" Matey. The friendliness of it. Just to prove how happy she was. Just to show the tall fellow how at home she felt and how she despised stupid conventions. Laura took a big bite of her bread and butter as she stared at the little drawing. She felt just like a work girl. Away Laura skimmed, over the lawn, up the path, up the steps, across the veranda, and into the porch. In the hall, her father and Laurie were brushing their hats ready to go to the office. "I say, Laura," said Laurie very fast, "you might just give a squiz at my coat before this afternoon, see if it wants pressing." "I will," said she. Suddenly, she couldn't stop herself. She ran at Laurie and gave him a small, quick squeeze. "Oh, I do love parties, don't you?" "Rather," said Laurie's warm, boyish voice, and he squeezed his sister too. The house was alive with soft, quick steps and running voices. The green baize door that led to the kitchen region swung open and shut with a muffled thud. And now there came a long, chuckling, absurd sound. It was the heavy piano being moved on its stiff casters. But the air, if you stopped to notice, was the air always like this? Little faint winds were playing chase, in at the tops of the windows, out at the doors. The front doorbell pealed, and a man's voice murmured, "What is it, Sadie?" Laura came into the hall. "It's the florist, Miss Laura." It was indeed. There, just inside the door, stood a wide, shallow tray full of pots of pink lilies. No other kind. Nothing but lilies. Carna lilies. Big pink flowers, wide open, radiant, almost frighteningly alive on bright crimson stems. "Oh, Sadie," said Laura, and the sound was like a little moan. She crouched down as if to warm herself at that blaze of lilies. She felt they were in her fingers, on her lips, growing in her breast. "It's some mistake," she said faintly. "Nobody ever ordered so many. Sadie, go and find Mother." But at that moment Mrs. Sheridan joined them. "It's quite right," she said calmly. "Yes, I ordered them. Aren't they lovely?" She pressed Laura's arm. "I was passing the shop yesterday, and I suddenly thought, for once in my life, I shall have enough Carna lilies. The garden party will be a good excuse." "Godbers has come," announced Sadie. That meant the cream puffs had come. Godbers were famous for their cream puffs. Nobody ever thought of making them at home. "Bring them in and put them on the table, my girl," ordered Cook. Sadie brought them in and went back to the door. Of course, Laura and Josie were far too grown up to really care about such things. All the same, they couldn't help agreeing that the puffs looked very attractive. Very. Cook began arranging them, shaking off the extra icing sugar. "Don't they carry one back to all one's parties?" said Laura. "Have one each, my dears," said Cook in her comfortable voice. "Your ma won't know." Oh, impossible! Fancy cream puffs so soon after breakfast. The very idea made one shudder. All the same, 2 minutes later, Josie and Laura were licking their fingers with that absorbed inward look that only comes from whipped cream. "Let's go into the garden, out by the back way," suggested Laura. "I want to see how the men are getting on with their marquee. They're such awfully nice men." But the back door was blocked by Cook, Sadie, Godber's man, and Hans. Something had happened. Clucked Cook like an agitated hen. Sadie had her hand clapped to her cheek as though she had toothache. Hans's face was screwed up in the effort to understand. Only Godber's man seemed to be enjoying himself. It was his story. "What's the matter? What's happened?" "There's been a horrible accident," said Cook. "A man killed." "A man killed? Where? How? When?" But Godber's man wasn't going to have his story snatched from under his very nose. "Know those little cottages just below here, miss?" Know them? Of course she knew them. "Well, there's a young chap living there, name of Scott, a carter. His horse shied at a traction engine this morning, and he was thrown out on the back of his head. Killed." "Dead?" Laura stared at Godber's man. "Dead when they picked him up," said Godber's man with relish. "They were taking the body home as I come up here." And he said to the cook, "He's left a wife and 5 little ones." "Josie, come here." Laura caught hold of her sister's sleeve and dragged her aside. "However are we going to stop everything?" "Stop everything, Laura?" cried Josie in astonishment. "What do you mean?" "Stop the garden party, of course. Why did Josie pretend? But Josie was still more amazed. Stop the garden party! My dear Laura, don't be so absurd. Of course we can't do anything of the kind. Nobody expects us to. Don't be so extravagant. But we can't possibly have a garden party with a man dead just outside the front gate. That really was extravagant, for the little cottages were in a lane to themselves at the very bottom of a steep hill that led up to the house. A broad road ran between. True, they were far too near. They were the greatest possible eyesore, and they had no right to be in that neighbourhood at all. They were little mean dwellings painted a chocolate brown. In the garden patches there was nothing but cabbage stalks, sick hens and tomato cans. The very smoke coming out of their chimneys was poverty-stricken. Little rags and shreds of smoke, so unlike the great silvery plumes that uncurled from the Sheridans' chimneys. Washerwomen lived in the lane, and sweeps and a cobbler, and a man whose house front was studded all over with minute bird cages. Children swarmed. When the Sheridans were little, they were forbidden to set foot there because of the revolting language and of what they might catch. But since they were grown up, Laura and Laurie on their prowls sometimes walked through. It was disgusting and sordid. They came out with a shudder. But still, one must go everywhere. One must see everything. So through they went. And just think of what the band would sound like to that poor woman, said Laura. Oh, Laura! Josie began to be seriously annoyed. If you're going to stop a band playing every time someone has an accident, you'll lead a very strenuous life. I'm every bit as sorry about it as you. Her eyes hardened. You won't bring a drunken workman back to life by being sentimental, she said softly. Drunk? Well, who said he was drunk? Laura turned furiously on Josie. I'm going straight up to tell Mother. Do, dear, cooed Josie. Mother, can I come into your room? Laura turned the big glass doorknob. Of course, child. Why, what's the matter? What's given you such a colour? And Mrs. Sheridan turned round from her dressing table. She was trying on a new hat. Mother, a man's been killed, began Laura. Not in the garden. No. Oh, what a fright you gave me. Mrs. Sheridan sighed with relief and took off the big hat and held it on her knees. But listen, Mother. Breathless, half choking, Laura told the dreadful story. Of course we can't have our party, can we? She pleaded. The band and everybody arriving, they'd hear us, Mother. They're nearly neighbours. To Laura's astonishment, her mother behaved just like Josie. It was harder to bear because she seemed amused. She refused to take Laura seriously. Darling! Mrs. Sheridan got up and came over to her, carrying the hat. Before Laura could stop her, she had popped it on. My child, said her mother, the hat is yours. It's made for you. Look at yourself. And she held up her hand mirror. But, Mother, Laura couldn't look at herself. She turned aside. This time Mrs. Sheridan lost patience. You are being very absurd, Laura, she said coldly. People like that don't expect sacrifices from us, and it's not very sympathetic to spoil everybody's enjoyment as you're doing now. I don't understand, said Laura, and she walked quickly out of the room into her own bedroom. There, quite by chance, the first thing she saw was this charming girl in the mirror, in her black hat trimmed with gold daisies and a long black velvet ribbon. Never had she imagined she could look like that. Is Mother right? She thought. And now she hoped her mother was right. Just for a moment, she had another glimpse of that poor woman and those little children, and the body being carried into the house. But it all seemed blurred. I'll remember it again after the party's over, she decided, and somehow that seemed quite the best plan. Lunch was over by 1:30. By 2:30 they were all ready for the fray. The green-coated band had arrived and was established in a corner of the tennis court. Laurie arrived and hailed them on his way to dress. At the sight of him, Laura remembered the accident. She wanted to tell him. If Laurie agreed with the others, then it was bound to be all right. "Laurie!" "Hello!" He was halfway upstairs, but when he turned round and saw Laura, he suddenly puffed out his cheeks and goggled his eyes at her. "My word, Laura, you do look stunning! What an absolutely topping hat!" Laura said faintly, "Is it?" and smiled up at Laurie, and didn't tell him after all. Soon after that, people began coming in streams. The band struck up. The hired waiters ran from the house to the marquee. Wherever you looked, there were couples strolling, bending to the flowers, greeting, moving on over the lawn. They were like bright birds that had alighted in the Sheridans' garden for this one afternoon, on their way to... where? Ah, what happiness it is to be with people who all are happy, to press hands, press cheeks, smile into eyes. "Darling Laura, how well you look! What a becoming hat, child!" And Laura, glowing, answered softly, "Have you had tea? Won't you have an ice? The passion fruit ices really are rather special." She ran to her father and begged him, "Daddy, darling, can't the band have something to drink?" And the perfect afternoon slowly ripened, slowly faded, slowly its petals closed. Never a more delightful garden party. The greatest success. Quite the most. Laura helped her mother with the goodbyes. They stood side by side in the porch till it was all over. All over," said Mrs. Sheridan. "Round up the others, Laura. Let's go and have some fresh coffee. I'm exhausted. Why will you children insist on giving parties?" And all of them sat down in the deserted marquee. "Have a sandwich, Daddy dear." "Thanks." Mr. Sheridan took a bite and the sandwich was gone. He took another. "I suppose you didn't hear of a beastly accident that happened today?" "My dear," said Mrs. Sheridan, holding up her hand, "we did. It nearly ruined the party. Laura insisted we should put it off." "Oh, Mother!" Laura didn't want to be teased about it. "It was a horrible affair," said Mr. Sheridan. "The chap was married, too. Lived just below in the lane." An awkward little silence fell. Mrs. Sheridan fidgeted with her cup. Really, it was very tactless of Father. Suddenly she looked up. There on the table were all those sandwiches, cakes, puffs, all uneaten, all going to be wasted. She had one of her brilliant ideas. "I know," she said. "Let's make up a basket. Let's send that poor creature some of this perfectly good food. She's sure to have neighbours calling in and so on. Laura," she jumped up, "get me the big basket out of the stairs cupboard." "But, Mother, do you think really it's a good idea?" Again, how curious. She seemed to be different from them all. To take scraps from their party. Would the poor woman really like that? "Of course. What's the matter with you today? An hour or two ago you were insisting on us being sympathetic, and now—" "Oh, well." Laura ran for the basket. It was filled. It was heaped by her mother. "Take it yourself, darling," said she. "Run down just as you are. No, wait. Take the arum lilies, too. People of that class are so impressed by arum lilies." "The stems will ruin her lace frock," said practical Jose. So they would, just in time. "Only the basket, then. And, Laura," her mother followed her out of the marquee, "don't on any account—" "What, Mother?" No, better not put such ideas into the child's head. "Nothing. Run along." It was just growing dusky as Laura shut their garden gates. A big dog ran by like a shadow. The road gleamed white, and down below in the hollow the little cottages were in deep shade. How quiet it seemed after the afternoon. Here she was, going down the hill to somewhere where a man lay dead, and she couldn't realise it. Why couldn't she? She stopped a minute, and it seemed to her that kisses, voices, tinkling spoons, laughter, the smell of crushed grass were somehow inside her. She had no room for anything else. How strange. She looked up at the pale sky, and all she thought was, yes, it was the most successful party. Now the broad road was crossed. The lane began, smoky and dark. Women in shawls and men's tweed caps hurried by. Men hung over the palings. The children played in the doorways. A low hum came from the mean little cottages. In some of them there was a flicker of light, and a shadow, crab-like, moved across the window. Laura bent her head and hurried on. She wished now that she had put on a coat. How her frock shone! And the big hat with the velvet streamer! If only it was another hat! Were the people looking at her? They must be. It was a mistake to have come. She knew all along it was a mistake. Should she go back even now? No. Too late. This was the house. It must be. A dark knot of people stood outside. The voices stopped as Laura drew near. The group parted. It was as though she was expected, as though they had known she was coming here. Laura was terribly nervous. Oh, to be away from this. She actually said, "Help me, God," as she walked up the tiny path and knocked. To be away from those staring eyes. "I'll just leave the basket and go," she decided. "I shan't even wait for it to be emptied." Then the door opened. A little woman in black showed in the gloom. Laura said, "Are you Mrs. Scott?" But to her horror, the woman answered, "Walk on, please, miss." And she was shut in the passage. "No," said Laura, "I don't want to come in. I only want to leave this basket. Mother sent." Laura found herself in a wretched little low kitchen, lighted by a smoky lamp. There was a woman sitting before the fire. Said the little creature who had let her in. It's a young lady." She turned to Laura. "I'm her sister, miss. You'll excuse her, won't you?" "Oh, but of course. Please don't disturb her. I only want to leave." But at that moment, the woman at the fire turned round. Her face, puffed up, red, with swollen eyes and swollen lips, looked terrible. She seemed as though she couldn't understand why Laura was there. What did it mean? Why was this stranger standing in the kitchen with a basket? And the poor face puckered up again. "All right, my dear," said the other. "I'll thank the young lady." And again she began, "You'll excuse her, miss, I'm sure." And her face, swollen too, tried an oily smile. Laura only wanted to get out, to get away. She was back in the passage. The door opened. She walked straight through into the bedroom where the dead man was lying. "You'd like a look at him, wouldn't you?" said M's sister, and she brushed past Laura over to the bed. "Don't be afraid, my lass." And now her voice sounded fond and sly, and fondly she drew down the sheet. "He looks a picture. There's nothing to show. Come along, my dear." Laura came. There lay a young man, fast asleep, sleeping so soundly, so deeply, that he was far, far away from them both. Oh, so remote, so peaceful. He was dreaming. Never wake him up again. His head was sunk in the pillow. His eyes were closed. They were blind under the closed eyelids. He was given up to his dream. What did garden parties and baskets and lace frocks matter to him? He was far from all those things. He was wonderful, beautiful. While they were laughing, and while the band was playing, this marvel had come to the lane. Happy, happy. All is well, said that sleeping face. This is just as it should be. I am content. But all the same, you had to cry, and she couldn't go out of the room without saying something to him. Laura gave a loud, childish sob. "Forgive my hat," she said. And this time she didn't wait for M's sister. She found her way out of the door, down the path, past all those dark people. At the corner of the lane, she met Laurie. He stepped out of the shadow. "Is that you, Laura?" "Yes." Mother was getting anxious. Was it all right? "Yes, quite. Oh, Laurie." She took his arm. She pressed up against him. "I say, you're not crying, are you?" Laura shook her head. She was. Laurie put his arm round her shoulder. "Don't cry," he said in his warm, loving voice. "Was it awful?" "No," sobbed Laura. "It was simply marvellous. But Laurie—" She stopped. She looked at her brother. "Isn't life—" she stammered. "Isn't life—" But what life was, she couldn't explain. No matter. He quite understood. "Isn't it, darling?" said Laurie.
Susie, thanks so much for that beautifully vivid reading. It just fully, I could see it all before my eyes. October 15th, 1921. All this week I had been most fearfully busy with a long story which was only finished late last night. Finished it is, however, thanks be to God. It's called The Garden Party. So that's just a little bit of from Katherine Mansfield's notebooks. And it's wonderful reading her commentary on her own stories. It's been an absolute revelation to me going through her notebooks, her diaries, her letters, and commenting on the garden party. She goes on to say, Laura feels things ought to happen differently. First one thing and then another. But life isn't like that. We haven't the ordering of it. Laura says, but all those things, a garden party, a man dead on the road, must not happen at once. And life answers, why not? How are they divided from each other? And I think when I first read this story myself, I was probably in high school in Canada, and I loved this slightly strange combination of the New Zealand setting with very, what I suppose at that age I very much recognise as upper middle class Anglo values, and I was sort of attracted by that sort of strange combination of a kind of English New Zealand setting and milieu. I thought that was quite unusual to me, and I love this is one of Katherine Mansfield's brilliant New Zealand stories, along with things like Prelude or At the Bay, and I'm sure some of you know those. So I sort of love that quality, and I loved or was interested in the fact that obviously it's exploring or it's indicting class hierarchies and class distinctions and the class system, which of course Katherine Mansfield didn't have much truck with for all sorts of great reasons that we all understand. But what I didn't get, and what's only come to me later in life about the story of the garden party, is what she says here. why not? How are they divided from each other? So Katherine Mansfield, for me, is a remarkable writer because she gives us an undivided world. Earlier today in a session, David Vann, who's here at the moment, was talking about high degrees of coherence in the short story form, that the short story form is most interesting and most powerful. I think of it as charge, that somehow Katherine Mansfield's stories are charged, but that comes from this vision she had, and I think she really is, or really was, a visionary writer, as well as being somebody who was absolutely grounded in this and in love with the stuff of life. But this undivided quality is something that goes through particularly stories from this period. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this period from sort of 1920 to 1923 and just back up a little bit. But maybe it's important to say that although she gives thanks to God and she's always thankful and joyous and spent in her notebooks after she's finished a story, she didn't actually have any religious belief or religious faith. And yet, life for her is absolutely sacred. She says, "I like always to have a great grasp of life so that I intensify the so-called small things, so that truly everything is significant." And in Susie's reading, you will have heard everything. Whipped cream is significant. The karaki trees. Am I saying that right, Susie? The karaki trees? Yes, the karaki trees. The detail, the love that she gives to the detail of the world. For me, it gives us that electrical charge quality, that pungently alive quality to her stories that almost makes them strangely animate themselves. And she says, thinking a little bit about what she wants to achieve, both in life and in fiction, she says, "You know how when one woman carries the newborn baby, the other woman approaches and says, 'Bless it.' But I am always wanting to lift the handkerchief off lizards' faces and pansies' faces and a house by moonlight. I'm always wanting to put a blessing on what I see. It's a queer feeling." So this comes through a lot of her notebooks, her diaries. This sense of a reverence for the details of the world, and it gives her work this remarkably, and I think quite movingly grounded qualities, as we will have heard there. But it also shows us different realities coexisting at the same time. And she fully grasped the truth of that. How while a man lies waked on a table cold with death, a garden party is going on next door, she knew that life was incongruous, that life was always disparate, and she yoked those together and showed us a sort of not a fragmented vision, but a whole vision. So different realities come together, but it's not fragmented. She somehow harnesses it and gives us back something quite extraordinary. So just to go back a little bit, I'm not a biographer. I'm not a Katherine Mansfield biographer. I'm not a Mansfield scholar. But I was asked recently to write an essay as a writer, a short story writer, looking at the stories of Katherine Mansfield. And I became fascinated and was really quite surprised, not knowing how much she'd written about her own art and the art of prose and the art of fiction. I'm also very interested in her relationship with other writers. So what I'd like to come on to as I just move through the next sort of 15, 20 minutes is come on to her relationship with Virginia Woolf in particular. She D.H. Lawrence and she had a really important relationship, but the other great relationship with another writer was with Virginia Woolf. And what I'd like to give you are these sort of bits of her voice to sort of bring her, in, as Diana said, in spirit into the room. Most of you will know this is the 125th anniversary of her birth. She was born October 1888 and died at the age of 34 in January 1923. So when I began to look through her stories, which, like this, her notebooks, her diaries, her letter, I was absolutely overwhelmed, really, and moved by the body of work she produced in an incredibly short life. For those of you who are not quite familiar with the story of Katherine Mansfield, she was diagnosed she'd been suffering from tuberculosis since 1910. She was diagnosed with it in 1918, and she died in 1923. In June 1919, she told Virginia Woolf, "Illness breaks down one's privacy, so one can't write." And I thought, how succinct and typically Mansfieldian to put it so sharply and clearly. But in October 1920, so really just over 2 years to live, and she had a burst of surprising energy, and she began to write stories again. She was mostly convalescing in France, at times earlier in Cornwall. She was always trying to find a better place to be for her health, and it was an ongoing search. And she was a long-time occupant of many hotels, many sort of temporary homes that she and John Middleton Murray rented, including a couple in Sussex. I think it was Rottingdean. Some of you, I'm sure, here will know. But she had a huge attachment to Sussex, and she and John Middleton Murray had a little ongoing fantasy, really, that peppers their notes and their letters to each other about a cottage in Sussex with pigs and chickens and eventually children, and that. Well, it never came to fruition, as we know, but she did have, I think, a 2-month period in West Sussex, just outside Chichester, in Runkton, when they thought they'd got their perfect cottage, and then they failed to be able to make rent. They were always struggling between their bits of money from review work and editorial work. So that period, the period in which The Garden Party is written, 1921, in this case, is this period, this intense burst of energy that she has. And again, I just find her sort of her commitments, her absolute energy, even though she could only write in the afternoons because of her health, and it was really quite serious. But she says, the more I do, the more I want to do, it will always be the same. The further one climbs, the more tops of mountains one sees. But it's a matter for rejoicing as long as one can keep the coffin from the door. And I'll just read little bits. Life is wonderful, wonderful, bittersweet, and anguish and a joy, and oh, shall I ever be able to express it? I really only ask for the time to write it all, time to write my books. And it's as if, for me, when I'm reading her stories, I'm sure this is that sort of pungently alive quality that so many of her stories have. It's as if she's investing in the masterpiece stories of this period. She's investing them with a sense of the life that she's not going to see. And although they really did hold out hope, because technically one could recover, as I'm sure many of you know, from tuberculosis, but her immune system was apparently already in bad shape because she also, without knowing it for a long time, suffered from gonorrhea, and that compromised her immune system. She also developed really, really chronic rheumatism, so that she said even holding her fountain pen was sometimes an agony, because apparently the rheumatism was a sort of side symptom of her condition. And she says, it's just, but I've never seen really such a kind of wonderful and sharp and honest description of illness. My cough from the TB is so much worse that I am a cough, a living, walking, or lying down cough. My lung creaks and I have done no work today. Or my whole chest boils, and this awful weakness makes even the pen feel like a walking stick. So you get these really acute, sharp, but not self-indulgent reflections on how she's enduring and how she's pushing forward to write. And I read the wonderful Claire Tomlin biography, which was written in 1987. And I admire that biography hugely. I read that before I went to Mansfield's notes and her letters. And after reading the biography, if I'm honest, I wasn't absolutely sure I liked Katherine Mansfield. Tomlin, for every good reason, emphasizes her tendency towards performance, towards lies occasionally, towards being a different person for every different person she met, and at times for being also quite held back. But so I wasn't really sure, as I emerged from Claire Tomlin's biography, I loved the work and the insights that I had into the fiction. But I thought I would like Katherine Mansfield. I'm not absolutely sure I do. Then I started reading her notes and her letters, and I love her. I just love her. Listen. I mean, how can you not love? I don't care, she says, what pain I suffer, so long as my handkerchiefs don't look as though I were in the pork butcher trade. It's quietly inspired. And she says, but we really have now found the most ideal place to live, and better still, I can whistle again. And I thought, imagine having to be and say, I can whistle again. Or, do you know how I am? Yesterday, upstairs in my room, I suddenly wanted to give a small jump. I have not given a small jump for 2 years, and this seemed such a miracle, I felt I must tell somebody. And I thought, fabulous. I thought she was just the most, wonderful woman. In January 1923, John Middleton Murray, her husband, whom she married 5 years previously, came to visit her in Switzerland, where she was trying to recuperate. And she apparently she actually died in one of these, not trying to jump or trying to whistle, but she tried to run upstairs to show Murray how well she was, and it brought on a hemorrhage that eventually killed her. The remarkable thing, I think, when I think about, like Chekhov, of course, who was her great, great hero, she was one of the first people in the English-speaking world to read Chekhov, because she also had a Russian translator friend who introduced her to Chekhov. And perhaps her greatest relationship with any other writer was with Chekhov, although he had died in 1904. But she often has little conversations in her own mind and with Chekhov, and she dreams of. She says, "Oh, perhaps there will be a private heaven for consumptives, and at least then I'll get to chat with Chekhov." So she has this huge fondness, and one can see the influence absolutely going through the work. But in both their stories, and their work is among probably my most favourite in short fiction. But with both of them, you feel. I suppose it's just an odd and maybe beautiful coming together of the short fiction form and the intensity of the short fiction form with the passing of life. There's something about the short fiction form that is very suited to showing us what it is to be alive, firstly, I think is important. It gives us this little tiny slice, and it has all the intensity and the charge. If it's been well made and well loved as a story as it was being written, it gives us this wonderfully intense sense of here is life, and it's somehow unfolding, vivid and alive on the page. It can be almost uncanny how alive seeming short stories can be. But I think that was particularly the case for Mansfield, as it was for Chekhov, because the brevity of the form and, if you like, the mortality that's built into the form seemed a particularly natural vehicle for her to inhabit and for her to invest with her absolute love of life that as her illness worsened. Many of you I know are writing short stories, and many of you, of course, are just readers devoted to the form. And I thought I would just pass on bits from her notebooks. I do believe, she says, that the time has come for a new word, but I imagine the new word will not be spoken easily. People have never explored the lovely medium of prose. It is a hidden country still. I feel that so profoundly. So she really wanted to take the form to a new place, to innovate, to wake us up with it. And in my view, it's absolutely what she achieves. Work, she says, is the one thing that never fails. Even if people don't like my stories, I don't mind. Perhaps they will one day, or the stories will be better. She was very, very hard on herself with the garden party, she, near the end of her life, well, she was quite down on all of her stories, is the truth. Near the end of her life, she described them, she was tired. She was very, very tired, and she described her stories, her final summary of her work, of her stories, is like little bred birds in cages. So she was obviously worn out as she approached 1923, and she said, of all my stories, I suppose The Garden Party is moderately successful. It's a masterpiece, of course. And she says, let me just see if I can find that little bit. She said she's critical even still, and that story had a good reception. She said, it's a moderately successful story, and that is all. It's somehow, in the episode at the Lane, scamped. And I assume that what she, is scamped, meaning it goes off. And it's interesting how sometimes writers aren't the best judges of their work, because it's actually, of course, as I'm sure you will have felt as Susie read it, it's that scene in the lane that makes the story. It's that coming together of this unlikely or unexpected reality, where it's a marvel. The death of that man, suddenly for Laura, is a marvel. It's a revelation. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful thing in the way that the cream puffs, of course, are not. But it's that. I think what's wonderful about Mansfield is the way, like Woolf, like Chekhov, the way moments for characters hold multiple truths, and sometimes contradictory truths. So it's grim. The lane is grim. She's frightened. It's a dark room. There's a man she's never seen or met before lying, laid out. It's a small room, it's cramped, the widow is swollen-faced. So it's really, about as harsh, I'm sure, a scene as Laura has ever seen. And yet she discovers a marvel in that room. So that conjunction of sort of seemingly disparate realities is, I think, the quality that makes it masterpiece quality. It's a little bit like a Chekhov story, The Beauty, where some of you might know it again. Beauty should just be beautiful, and obviously that's what we think. Beauty is beautiful. Who could argue with that? And yet the main feeling that Chekhov, again, he goes in, we have the impact of the beauty in that story, but with that we have a sense of real melancholy, that somehow seeing somebody so beautiful is almost leaves you with nothing after. There's nowhere to go from that. There's a real sense of a boy haunted by melancholy after seeing this incredibly beautiful girl. With Mansfield's stories, you can't help but be impressed, I think, just by the whole world that she distills. Her worlds are so beautifully compressed. Yesterday, Helen Dunmore was here and said that if she had 2 desert island short stories, she would choose Katherine Mansfield's New Zealand stories, Prelude and At the Bay, which show the family is really very much based on her own family, the Beauchamps, just as the Sheridan family is very much based on her own family in a suburb of Wellington in New Zealand. So with we get that sense of a whole world, as Helen was saying, just so lightly held up, and yet it's dense, it's alive, and it's complete. There's a sense of wholeness. It's so hard for one to create in the space of, I'm not sure, 20 pages. But she says, again, for those of you who are writing, to my knowledge, there aren't any superfluous words. I mean every line of it. I'm a powerful stickler for form in this style of work. And this is quite funny. I hate the sort of license that English people give themselves to spread and flop and roll about. I feel as fastidious as though I wrote with acid. And she says it's a very queer thing how craft comes into writing. I mean, down to details. I choose not only the length of every sentence, but even the sound of every sentence. I choose the rise and fall of every paragraph. After I'd written it, I'd read it aloud, numbers of times, over and over, just as one would play over a musical composition, trying to get it nearer and nearer. If a thing has really come off, it seems to me there mustn't be one single word out of place, or one word that could be taken out. That's how I aim to write. It will take some time to get anywhere near there. And, for example, she's had an editor-writer who wants certain cuts, but by this point she's absolutely, no one's touching my work. And she says they can keep their old £40 and be hanged to them. Should I pick the eyes out of a story for £40? So I just love, she's absolutely focused, absolutely sure of herself on the page at certain points. Her structure, she was asked by one editor to write, can you not write things that are more plotty? And she said, plotty, what about that for a word? It made my hair stand up on prongs. A nice plotty story, please. People are funny, she says. I'm just sort of sloughing off that editor. Her stories are not plotty. I mean, the Garden Party is perhaps slightly plottier than many of them, that we have a kind of clear event and a clear turning point. So it's a story very much shaped around that clear, pivotal moment of change when the world will never quite be the same again. But many of her stories are more organic in form. They don't have that sort of unity, revelation happening across a unity of scenes. Instead, they seem to unfold, and she describes it as that, like a flower. It just unfolds and opens as I write it. And very often, the seed of the end is in many ways held in the beginning of her stories, which is something true to perhaps to many short story writers. Her style loosened up a great deal after going to the Post-Impressionist exhibition, and she was particularly struck by the paintings of Van Gogh. So she loves the colour, the natural world, the play of light are all wonderful hallmarks of Katherine Mansfield's style. She, like Virginia Woolf, was in love with the natural world, and they shared that absolutely. And they walked in this area when Virginia Woolf lived at Asham House, not far, very close to Lewis. Mansfield actually, not only did they correspond, but Mansfield came down, and they spent about 5 days together, and they walked and talked about the thistledown and various flora and fauna that they came across on their walk. But of the paintings, the Van Gogh, she says, they taught me something about writing, which was queer, a kind of freedom, or rather a shaking free. So she was this intense realist, as Leonard Woolf dubbed her, but there was something stranger than straight realism in the work of Katherine Mansfield. Her work, as much as she's dedicated to the real and to really getting life on the page, it's detail. She says, I delight in detail not for the sake of detail itself, but for the life in the life of it. So it's about sort of almost fuel injecting your story with the stuff of life, and that's transmitted to the readers. Readers, we feel that, of course we do. She's not a miniaturist. I think she's often called a miniaturist, and I always think that's a little bit disparaging myself. But she is specific about the details of the world, and at the same time, her great fidelity to reality is... It turns into something stranger, something surreal. So it's the surreal with the real in Katherine Mansfield. We get boys who are running along the beach described as twinkling spiders. We get, oh goodness, I'm trying to think of, there's this, at the end of Miss Brill, which is a story some of you might know, there's this almost as if a fox fur tail is put away in a box, and one hears a sort of cry come out of the box at the very end. I shouldn't even, that's a bit of a spoiler. She brings this uncanny sense of life to her work. I want to say just a little bit more about Woolf and Mansfield together, because I just find that the two of them fascinating. In 1916, if you might recall that Virginia Woolf's novel, The Voyage Out, had been published in 1915. Lytton Strachey passes on to Virginia Woolf Katherine Mansfield's praise of that. And Virginia Woolf says, Katherine Mansfield has dogged my steps for almost 3 years. I'm always on the point of meeting her or of reading her stories. They have dinner in 1916, and Virginia Woolf says of Katherine Mansfield, I also think she has a much better idea of writing than most, but she's an odd character. Katherine Mansfield writes to Virginia and says that in August 1917, thank you for letting me see Ascham. It is very wonderful, and I feel that it will flash upon one corner of my inward eye forever. It was good to have time to talk to you. We've got the same job, Virginia, and it is really very curious and thrilling that we should both, quite apart from each other, be after so very nearly the same thing. We are, you know, there's no point denying it. And of course what they were both after was not only the rendering of the natural world, which they both were so dedicated to, but also questions about what is reality. How does perception affect our sense of reality? Is the here and now, is it quite relative? Is it provisional? What is consciousness? Is the self a whole, or is it a fragmented thing? So these common interests, as well as that love of colour, light, and the natural world, made them very interested in one another's work. They had their moments when things fell apart. In 1918, Virginia Woolf has this to say about Katherine Mansfield. One of her stories was called Bliss. I threw down Bliss with an exclamation. She's done for. Indeed, I don't see how much faith in her as a woman or a writer can survive that sort of story. I shall have to accept the fact, I'm afraid, that her mind is very thin soil indeed, laid an inch or two deep upon very barren rock. She is content with superficial smartness, and the whole conception is poor, cheap, not the vision, however imperfect, of an interesting mind. She writes badly too, and the effect was, as I say, to give me an impression of her callousness and hardness as a human being. I shall read it again, but I don't suppose I shall change my mind. And likewise, there are little bits in Katherine Mansfield where she has a very astringent wit, and things go off, and she's quite critical. She gives Virginia Woolf quite a harsh review of Night and Day in November 1919, which Virginia isn't very happy about. But just to conclude and just open the floor a little bit to any questions you might have, their friendship carried on. They wrote letters. Virginia Woolf was often slightly, it would be exaggerating to say, she was hurt, I think, by the lack of response that she had to many of her letters so she would write to Katherine. She was the older of the two. She was 6 years older than Katherine. And at some point, when Katherine's illness became just so severe, many of her friends and acquaintances really weren't aware of how it affected her so badly. So, because Katherine and John Middleton Murray didn't want people to know, so their friendship seemed to lapse. And the final reference we get, actually, it's not the final, but it is the note that Woolf makes in her diaries when she's trying to wrestle with her feelings of great friendship and, of course, rivalry. So she says, one feels, this is upon the death of Katherine Mansfield in 1923, one feels what? A shock or relief, a rival the less, then confusion at feeling so little, then gradually blankness and disappointment, and then a depression which I could not rouse myself from all that day. When I began to write, it seemed to me that there was no point in writing. Katherine won't read it. Katherine is my rival no longer. More generously, I felt, but though I can do this better than she could, where is she who could do what I can't? So I think it's quite an interest, and again, typically Woolf, it's typically honest searching of her own feelings at that point. Later, about 4 years later, after Mansfield's death, she'll write to Vita Sackville-West, and she'll say, "We are both compelled, she and Katherine, to meet simply in order to talk about writing. This we did by the hour. And then she goes on, comes back. The fact remains, I mean, she had a quality I adored and I needed. I think her sharpness and her reality, that was the thing I wanted then. I dream of her often still. Now that's an odd reflection, how one's relationship with a person seems to be continued after death, in dreams, and with an odd reality in them as well. And of her relationship, she says, this is October 1924, never again shall I have the like of one of it. Virginia kept many of Catherine's letters. I think Catherine, we have fewer of Virginia's letters to Catherine because her life was so transient. She was moving between so many locations, hotels, sanatoriums, and so on. All right, everyone, we have just about... okay, that's okay, we're fine. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
That was such a rich and thought-provoking and dense talk about Katherine Mansfield, her life and her work and her relationship with Virginia Woolf. I'm sure it's going to provoke so many questions that we actually wouldn't really be able to remotely do them justice now. So I just thought it's probably better to end on a high than for me disappointing half the audience and just saying, oh, we can just take 2 questions. So what I'm going to suggest is that when I round this up and we give Alison and Susie another round of applause, that you remain seated. I take them, particularly Alison, to the back of the barn, to the bookstall, where I'm sure she'll be willing to answer questions about Katherine Mansfield and about her own work, which I just want to say again, her new novel, Unexploded, is... I evoked the spirit of Katherine Mansfield before, but Unexploded is certainly suffused with the spirit of Virginia Woolf. So look, I mean, you couldn't have given us more of Katherine Mansfield. We really, really do appreciate it. Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Susie.
Pleasure.